sermon series looking at different royalty throughout the Old Testament and kind of finding lessons in our lives or lessons in their lives to apply to our own as we look to shape our hearts ultimately after the King of Kings. And so last week, if you remember, we talked about Solomon. If you were able to join us, we kind of saw his downfall. Right, so we talk about the wisdom of Solomon, we talk about all of this knowledge and wisdom and wealth and power that he gains and all of these material things that he chooses to gain, but that at the very end of his life he begins to kind of lose control over some of these things that he has for himself. And he gives into all of these small compromises of turning away from the laws given to the people of Israel and turning away from what God had intended for him as he gives into all of these marriages to people who are from tribes and nations that they were specifically told, do not marry these people. And he eventually starts to build all of these altars and build all of these places of worship for these other gods that was very against what he was intended to do as the king of God's chosen people. And last week, as we concluded the sermon, we looked that there are these huge consequences for when he does that. He's told that the nation will be pulled away from his family and given to his servant, and that because of the love that God has for his father David, not for Solomon, but for his father, because of who David was and the heart that David had, because of God's love for him, only one tribe was going to be spared and continue this lifelong nation through Solomon, the nation of Judah. And so where I want to pick up is very far down the line. Right, so where I want to pick up is very far down this unfortunate path that Solomon has established for his family and for the nation of Israel as a whole. But before we dive in, I want to start as I usually do. We don't have a game. I'm not going to make you stand up. Maybe some of you are really grateful for that. I'm not going to make you walk around. I'm not doing that this time. I do want to start with a movie because I do love movies. And I haven't used a movie in a few weeks, right? So we can maybe track along. The movie that I really want to start with, and there are several examples of this kind of narrative that plays out, but the movie that I really want to focus on is the movie Black Panther. I don't know if any of you are big Marvel fans.
There you go.
You like Marvel movies?
Yeah.
Superheroes? Okay, me too. So I love Marvel movies, and I'm all about superhero movies. And recently, I think like 2018, 2019, somewhere in there, I think it was 2018, maybe even earlier. No, it was definitely earlier than that. Anyway, not important. A movie called Black Panther comes out, right? And the idea is that there's this king, and his name is T'Challa, right? It's an African country, and so they have this monarchy system, right? And so his dad was the previous king, and as we've already established through monarchies, like his dad before him, and all of his ancestors have led this nation before the Black Panther, so the main character of the movie. Now, one of the things that I really love about this movie is that there's this one scene that takes place. You see, T'Challa was born, the Black Panther was born into this family where he believed that his ancestors have done things completely right their entire life. He believes that their way of life has always been right until he's faced with this very real issue of what has happened to a cousin that he has. You see, a cousin that he has was abandoned in the United States when his cousin's father, his uncle, ultimately betrays the nation, and they choose to abandon the cousin in the United States. And so this cousin comes to kind of exact revenge, and while his cousin's motives are very flawed, is use the resources of their nation to benefit the world. And until this very point, his ancestors have isolated their nation from the rest of the world. So all of the things that their nation could ultimately help and fix, they have chosen not to and keep it to themselves. And eventually, the Black Panther is faced with this reality that his ancestors have done things wrong the whole time. And he comes to this reality that things need to change. And there's this kind of tribalism thing that is not biblically based because it's a comic book movie, but you know what? We're going to deal with it anyway, so let's just bear with me. So he consumes this herb and he's sent to this like ancestral plane, right? It's very mystical kind of stuff. And ultimately he gets to face his ancestors and tell them that what they've done is wrong and that things need to change in order for the nation to truly prosper and in order for the world to truly prosper. And I love this idea because oftentimes as humans we find ourselves stuck in these kinds of generational things. Right? We find ourselves in these places where it's always been done this way. Things have never changed, for the entirety of our family lineage. Things have never changed. We've always done it this way. This is the only way to do it. And sometimes we just have to come to the realization that maybe it's just not true. Maybe there's a different way and a better way at doing this. As I was preparing for this sermon, I really started getting into this concept known as generational curses. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the topic of generational curses. It's not a very mainstream thing. It's kind of a more religious thing, but I did find some outside resources outside of Christianity and things to kind of talk about generational curses. But the idea is this. The idea is that there are habits and sins that we have in our lives that because we are unable to kind of slay these little demons in our lives, because we are unable to deal with it on our own part, our children inevitably see these habits and these sins in our lives, and so they take on these habits and sins, and then their children take on these habits and sins, and their children and their children and their children, thus initiating this generational curse. Today I want to look at a very clear biblical example of generational curses. And it all starts with Solomon, who we looked at last week. We looked at how he sets up these altars for these idols. He sets up ways to worship all these people that are not the one true God, all these false gods. And that is initially established through Solomon. And this is a habit and an issue that starts there and continues to progress until the story that we're going to talk about. So if you have your Bible, turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 18. We're not going to go there yet. Just kind of hang with me for a while. I want to kind of map out. So we're jumping very far ahead. Last week we looked at Solomon, which was in the 1 Kings. We're going to be jumping all the way to 2 Kings. But before we do that, I want to map out what this generational curse looks like in their lives and in their family lineage. Solomon dies, and this man named Jeroboam, who was one of the servants of his household, seeks to overthrow and take control of the nation of Israel from his son, from Solomon's son, Rehoboam. So Jeroboam ultimately overthrows Rehoboam, and Rehoboam establishes the nation of Judah. So it's a completely separate nation from Israel. They are not the same. Rehoboam becomes king of Judah, and in 1 Kings 14, chapter 14, verse 23, we see Rehoboam building high places. Now, these high places are places of worship to false gods. Rehoboam follows this generational curse of Solomon and worships false gods and establishes places for them to be worshipped in kings that follow Rehoboam. And the interesting thing about all of these kings, except for one, which I'll deal with, the interesting thing is that every single one of them is considered a good king and is in good standing with God. But there's one major flaw that all of them have. You have King Asa, who is seen as righteous in the eyes of the Lord. But 1 Kings 15:14, although he was righteous in the eyes of the Lord, he did not remove the high places. The high places established to worship false gods, he did not remove. King Joash, same story. 2 Kings chapter 12, Joash is seen as righteous in the eyes of God, but yet again does not tear down the high places. King Amaziah, 2 Kings 14, verse 4, same issue. Seen as righteous, does not tear down the high places. King Azariah, 2 Kings 15:4, the very next chapter, seen as righteous, does not tear down the high places. King Jotham, 2 Kings 15:35, seen as righteous, does not tear down the high places. Then we get to King Ahaz, which is the father of the main character that we're going to be looking at here in a second. His name's Hezekiah. He becomes king of Judah. His father, Ahaz, is the exception to this list that I've just listed off. He is neither righteous nor tears down high places. And in fact, he chooses to worship false gods. He does not live according to God's righteousness and according to faithfulness. Then we get to 2 Kings chapter 18. There's going to be a man named Hezekiah who looks at this long family history of idolatry, of unfaithfulness, and not just his own initial family, not just the nation of Judah, but he also looks at the nation of Israel and realizes that there's been this generational pattern. And if you really think about it, this dates all the way back to even the days before Moses, of the nation of Israel choosing to worship and practice this idolatry. And when he sees this, he says that it stops with me. If we can go ahead and put that up. 2 Kings 18, verse 1 through 8, says this. In the 3rd year of Israel's king Hoshea, son of Elah, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, became king of Judah. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestor David had done. Now, this is a description that was given to... This is not the Bible. This is my little commentary on that. That was a description given to all the kings that I had listed, except for Ahaz. So all those kings meet that description. Now, verse 4, it says this. He removed the high places, shattered the sacred pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze stake that Moses made, for until then the Israelites were burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. Hezekiah relied on the Lord, God of Israel. Not one of the kings of Judah was like him, either before him or after him. He remained faithful to the Lord and did not turn from following him, but kept the commands the Lord had commanded Moses. The Lord was with him, and wherever he went, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. He defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its borders, from watchtower to fortified city. So we have this man Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah has this long family history, this generational curse of not being able to tear down idolatry in their life. This was a sinful habit that was practiced by every king before him, leading up to Solomon. When Hezekiah realizes this, he feels the need to tear it down. To reiterate this passage, in the third year of Israel's king, Hoshea, the son of Elah, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, became king of Judah. He did what was right in the Lord's sight, and he removed the high places. Not only did he choose to follow God and be faithful on his own part, but he decides to establish something new. To go against what had been practiced by all of his ancestors, to go against what everybody had just kind of accepted as normal practice. He chooses to stand opposed and say, it stops with me. Regardless of what everybody has done before my time, it stops with me and my family. 2 Chronicles chapter 29, the books of Chronicles kind of emphasize different aspects of these kings, so it follows the same kind of lineage, but just emphasizes different portions. And it says this: in the first year of his reign, in the first month, he, being Hezekiah, opened the doors of the Lord's temple and repaired them. So not only does he just tear down the places of worship for these false idols, he decides to reestablish the place of worship for the Lord. He chooses to reestablish the place of the Lord. Now, this was not some small task to just rebuild these doors. It was an investment. These doors were adorned with gold. All of this gold, you see, this was Solomon's temple that Hezekiah is looking to reestablish. This is a very ornate temple. It is not some small, trivial task like, oh yeah, Hezekiah did these cool things, like, oh yeah, he tore down this place of worship, oh yeah, and he reestablished the temple. It was like, no. Hezekiah invested heavily into setting the worship of the Lord at the forefront of Jerusalem and in the nation of Judah. This brings us to our first point, that a royal heart rights wrongs. A royal heart rights wrongs. That my prayer is this, that as we look and analyze our own hearts, and as we look to have the heart of royalty, one that follows after the King of Kings, that when we look at what has gone on in our own families, when we look at what has gone on in our communities, that when we look at all these injustices around the world, and when we look at the injustices in our own community, that we would look at this and say, it stops with me. That whatever generational curses we may have in our families, whatever issues may have been modeled for us, whether it's alcoholism or whether it's drug abuse or whatever it is, whether it's lust and pornography, whatever issues we may have had in our families, whatever may have been modeled for us, that we would look within our own lives and within our own families and say, it stops with me. That no matter what my father did, regardless of what my mother did, regardless of what my grandfather and my great-grandfather and all of these people, regardless of what my ancestors modeled for me, it stops with me. If it's not of the Lord. Because that's what Hezekiah does. He looks at this long lineage of sin and says, no more. During my reign, during my rule, it stops with me. No more will the people worship false gods. It stops with me. My question is, what stops with you? What can you see in your own family? What can you see in your own community? What influences have you witnessed that you can say, this is not Christ honoring, and so it stops with me? Because ultimately, a royal heart rights wrongs. And another key principle that I really want to focus on in Hezekiah's life is this. In 2 Kings 18:5-8, it says this, to re-emphasize this portion of the passage. Hezekiah relied on the Lord God of Israel. Not one of the kings of Judah was like him, either before him or after him. He remained faithful to the Lord and did not turn from following him, but kept the commands the Lord had commanded Moses. The Lord was with him, and wherever he went, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. He defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its borders, from watchtower to fortified cities. When Hezekiah sees what has gone on and he chooses to tear down these high places, what that passage really emphasizes is that Hezekiah relied on the Lord. He relied on God and God alone. He didn't turn towards other idols. He didn't turn towards other nations. The reason that it's even mentioned that he rebels against the king of Assyria is that in his generation, in his ancestry, when things got tough, they turned to other nations. So not only did they turn to other gods, they turned to these nations that worshiped other gods, and when they had issues with other nations, they would ask people like the Assyrians to help them. And Hezekiah says, that stops with me. We rely on God and God alone here in my house. Who do you rely on? 2 Chronicles 29, the Chronicles narrative of Hezekiah's life. This is verse 6-10 says this, and we'll go ahead and put that up. For our ancestors were unfaithful and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord our God. This is Hezekiah. As he's established this temple, he sets apart the Levites, the ones who were meant to establish worship and lead the worship of God. He pulls them aside and sets them apart and consecrates them before the Lord, and he has to have this conversation with these men. And it says this, that they abandoned him. They also closed the doors of the portico, extinguished the lamps. They did not burn incense and did not offer burnt offerings in the holy place of the God of Israel. Therefore, the wrath of the Lord was on Judah and Jerusalem, and he made them an object of terror, horror, and mockery, as you see with your own eyes. Our fathers fell by the sword, and our sons, our daughters, and our wives are in captivity because of this. It is in my heart now to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his burning anger may turn away from us. Hezekiah pulls these Levites, these priests, and he shows them this generational curse. He exposes it to the religious leaders of his day and says, look at what has happened because of our unfaithfulness. Because my father and my father's father, because they allowed this to be established, look at what has happened to us. Look at what's gone on to our men. Look at what's gone on to our daughters, to our sons. Look at what is happening to our people. It stops with us. And because of this, the Lord's anger turns away because of Hezekiah's faithfulness. Because he is willing to rely on God and to turn away from these idols, and not only just himself, but turn his people away from unrighteousness, God allows him to prosper wherever he goes. And this brings us to our second point and our final point. that a royal heart relies on the Lord. We can go ahead and put that up. A royal heart relies on the Lord. For Hezekiah, it was not enough to simply live righteously for himself. It was not enough, as it was with his ancestors, to just simply be good enough on his own. It was good enough to eradicate idolatry and unrighteousness within his nation. Now, my question for you is this: where do you have influence? Where do you have influence? My guess is that you're not a king. My guess is that you're not a queen. Maybe how you live here. I don't know why you would be here if you have like your own entire country. My guess is that you don't have this nation that relies on you. My guess is that you are not the head of this great nation that was meant to be set apart from the rest of the world. My guess is that, like Black Panther, you're probably not the king of some tribe over in Africa. I'm guessing. My guess is that you don't have all of these huge nations and peoples that look up to you, but who does? Who does? Do you have cousins? Do you have uncles? Do you have family? Do you have children? Do you have people in your life? Do you have neighbors that look up to you? And if you do, what kind of example are you setting? Are you willing to look at your own life and say, this has to stop? I know that my mom did this. I know that my grandma did this. I know that my great-grandma did this. But it stops with me. That just because they did it doesn't mean that I have to. What can you do in your life to change? What changes can be made? What practices do you know are not of God that can be eradicated? What example can you set for those around you? Because if people can't look to us for guidance, who can they turn to? The internet, with all of its different messages, to social media, where it's constantly being crammed that if you don't make this kind of money, and if you're not living this kind of life, and you're not doing it right, where can people turn if they can't turn to us? If we can't be trusted to be a good example to those in our lives, who can? According to the example of Hezekiah, if we're willing to take a look at our own lives and say, it stops with me, the buck stops here, we can set an example for those around us. So what kind of life are you living? Are your attentions torn and divided amongst different things? Do you look towards other distractions in order to fill your lives? Last week we kind of talked about this God-shaped hole in our hearts that we try to fill with other things, and we place those other things above God, and we choose to rely on those things. We choose to rely on power and wealth and popularity and all of these other things, and we choose to focus on love, and we choose not to rely on the Lord, as Hezekiah. What does your heart rely on? What habits and sins have been modeled for you that you've just kind of accepted that this is just the way it is? Well, men are wired this way. That's why I do this. It's just who we are. What can change and what needs to change? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you've given us. God, we thank you for biblical examples of what it looks like to live in righteousness. God, we thank you for examples of kings and queens that came before us that model how we should live. God, I pray that as we look and learn from the life of Hezekiah, God, we would look and find within ourselves things that just need to stop. Generational curses that we've seen modeled in our own lives, in our own families, with our parents and our grandparents. God, that we would look at these things, these habits, no matter how bad they are, and we would say, God, it stops with me, and I will set an example for those around me. God, I pray that as we depart from here, that we would rely on you and you alone. God, that we won't rely on other things, God, that we won't rely on material wealth or possessions or anything that's materialistic, God, but that we would rely on you because you are faithful. God, we thank you and we love you and we are so grateful for your faithfulness that was evidenced through the work of Christ on the cross all those years ago. God, we thank you for your grace and your forgiveness. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. As per usual, this week, time of invitation. If you have any prayer requests that you would like to have lifted up, any decisions that you would like to make, now would be the time to do so as the Spirit comes and leads us one of us.